All right, welcome to Chapter 5, Section 3 on genetics. Today we're going to be talking about the cell and inheritance. And really important today that we understand that what we're going to be doing today is combining what we've learned already from previous chapters on the cell and what we've learned recently on heredity and inheritance. And we're going to combine or marry those two items together to understand how it happens at the cellular level. We're going to be dealing with some terminology and some new things for you to understand and know. And really our purpose as we go across this section is to be able to better understand at a cellular level what's happening. 3 quick objectives. We're going to learn what role chromosomes play in inheritance today. Excuse me. We're going to learn what events occur during meiosis, not to be confused with mitosis. Totally different concept, totally different process. And we're going to learn what the relationship is between chromosomes and genes. Okay, so that's our purpose today. That's what we're going to get at. So we need to start by just understanding a few things. We need a little bit of history. I'm going to put these up for you, and I'm going to talk through a couple things. Oops, sorry. Got to go way back in the early 1900s. There was a geneticist by the name of Walter Sutton, who was an American geneticist, who was studying basically the cells of grasshoppers and trying to figure out how the sex cells were actually produced, how they were formed, and basically focused on chromosomes and what happened during the formation of these sex cells. And from his research, what he found is that when he looked at the grasshopper, the body cells of a grasshopper, he would find that they would have 24 chromosomes in a grasshopper body cell. However, when he looked at the sex cells, he found that they only had 12. And so this really brought up an understanding or observing that what happens when a sperm and an egg cell join during fertilization, that the fertilized egg would go from a haploid cell to a diploid cell. And we have to understand, I throw those words around, let's explain what we mean by this. A diploid cell in science means this. It means that that cell contains 2 sets of chromosomes, one from each parent. Okay, so we are generally diploids. Most organisms are, because inside, if we look down here, notice inside that DNA, the genetic information, those chromosomes have 2 sets. So there's 1 set from mom and 1 set from dad, or male and female, as we're dealing with organisms. A haploid cell, in this case, this would be the sex cells or the gamete cells, only contains 1 set, as we see down here. Okay, now it makes sense if you think about it. If an organism is going to reproduce, they're going to reproduce sexually, okay, which we're going to talk about here, then they only need half of the material. If they had if they were diploid and you had a diploid and a diploid, well, then you would have, their new body cells would have 4 sets of chromosomes, and it would just keep reproducing and multiplying each time. So this really works best in genetics because this allows, by having a haploid and a haploid that combines, you get a single diploid cell. Chromosome theory of inheritance is basically what Sutton came up with, became known as, and according to the chromosome theory of inheritance, genes are carried from parents to their offspring on chromosomes. That's where the genes are. The chromosomes are the genetic information for that organism. Also need to understand, though, while we're talking about this, that when we talk about sexual reproduction is what we're discussing with meiosis, okay, we're actually talking about when the genetic material from 2 different parents combines to produce a new organism. That is an example of sexual reproduction. So when we move on, we need to understand this process of meiosis. Now, meiosis, as we're going to show the different steps here, okay, oops. Sorry about that. Go back. In meiosis, basically what we're getting is, this is the process by which the number of chromosomes is reduced by half. So remember, in mitosis, mitotic cell division, we were actually getting a replication of the full DNA, so then the 2 cells would split and you'd have 2 working cells. It was a form of growth or reproduction. In meiosis, we're actually pulling apart the DNA or the chromosomes so that you have half the information, which is the production of the sex cells. So I'm going to take you through the steps through it and then explain exactly what's going on. So before meiosis begins, what you end up getting is every chromosome in the parent cell will be copied. And so very similar to mitosis, you'll see the centrioles, you'll see the centromeres that combine and hold the chromatids together. So we have this DNA, we have 2 copies of each one, just like we saw in mitosis. Then in meiosis 1, okay, this is B2A, step 2A, you get the chromosome pairs will line up. So very similar to what we saw in mitosis, the metaphase. So they'll line up at the center of the cell. And the pairs will separate and move. Now notice the difference is these pairs are not being split. So we're actually separating. So we'll have 1 full set on one side, 1 full set on the other. And so by the end of meiosis 1, you actually will have 2 cells that have formed that now have a complete pair of DNA. Now if it stopped right there, that would be really very much like mitosis, right? But it doesn't. In meiosis 2, step 2, now what will happen is we take basically this new information from the end of meiosis 1, and the chromosomes will again line up with their 2 chromatids, right, move towards the center. But this time, notice that the spindle fibers will actually pull those chromatids apart to the opposite ends of the cell. And so what we're left with at the end of meiosis is 4 cells that are going to form that are sex cells. These are gamete cells. Each cell only has half of the number of chromosomes that the parent cell had at the beginning of this process. And each of the cells, each of these cells only have 1 chromosome from each of the original pair. And so what's happened is you've actually created in this process difference. So every single cell is going to be a little bit different based upon how they divide apart. So during meiosis, the biggest thing is those chromosome pairs separate and are distributed to different cells. Those sex cells have half as many of the chromosomes as the other cells in the organism. Now, interestingly enough, this process of meiosis is how those gametes form and how we have such variety in the organisms that can be produced through sexual reproduction, because each of these cells can be vastly different based upon the way that the chromosomes have been divided. So that is meiosis. We can understand meiosis through a Punnett square, okay, and this is one way. It's actually a way to show what happens during meiosis. Now remember, with Punnett squares, what we're doing here is we've put the male parent's information on top, and this is represented by what would be the sperm cells, okay? Those are the male cells that are the sex cells or gametes. And then on the female parent, we've represented the possible egg cells, okay? So these are possible. So for example, let's say that we had the possible allele combination for fertilization. This would be obviously capital T, lowercase t, capital T, lowercase t. Those are both heterozygous. So these would be hybrid organisms, okay? And notice what can happen. The possibles, we can have 25% that have big T, big T. We have 50% that have big T, little t, that are like their parents, and then 25% that has little t, little t. So what this shows and demonstrates is that meiosis gives basically 4 different possible sperm cells or possible traits that can be combined between these 2 events of meiosis. So the last thing we're going to talk about is talking about the lineup of genes. We need to understand the human body, each cell in the human body, excluding, okay, so each body cell, so not including gametes or sex cells, has 46 chromosomes, 23 chromosome pairs from mom, 23 chromosome pairs from dad. What's interesting to understand is that chromosomes, while they're made up of many different genes linked together or joined together, think of it like if you've made a bead necklace before and you attach them on a string and they connect kind of together. The chromosomes can actually have different alleles for different genes and the same alleles for others. So just because they code for the same thing doesn't mean that they have the same properties. So let me give you an example. So let's say this is a chromosome pair. Okay, so one of our 23 pairs of chromosomes. So we have 46 total, but there are 23 pairs. So these are 2 pairs looking at each other, Notice that the gene for A that codes for A and the gene that codes for A over here, these would both be genes that code for the same thing, but notice that the allele, okay, may be dominant or recessive, okay? See the same thing here. You could have dominant and recessive. Or you may have a situation where both alleles, okay, actually code for the same thing. So you don't, chromosomes, while they're joined together, okay, while they are important, they link up together. The pairs can have either different alleles, like we see here, or the same alleles, like we see here. So either of those options, okay, can happen depending upon just how the genes line up. And so just realizing that while they will code for the same phenotype, like the A's will, the B's will, the C's will, they may not code the same allele, even though they still are coding for the same thing. And that's important because what that does, obviously, is we have over 35,000 genes in our set of chromosomes. So each of those controls a trait, and each of those are important in helping set up who we are and what we are. And so making sure that they link up and match up between mom and dad is important. If our genetic information and our genes for mom were different from that for dad, and what they then we wouldn't be human. So really important concept to understand. So that's just that was a quick one, just talking about how cells and meiosis work in organisms. And so please finish your haiku questions, summarize and answer your questions, and get your vocab words, and I will see you guys in class. Bye.